Picture a girl of 14 standing in a cold hallway before the sun has even thought about rising, holding a candle stub in one hand and a tin box of black lead polish in the other. She has already been awake for 20 minutes. She will not sit down properly until well past noon. And if she makes one mistake today, one smudged grate, one late tray, one too loud footstep on the stairs, she could lose not just her position, but her home, her income, and her good name, all in the same afternoon. That was not a bad day for a Victorian housemaid. That was Tuesday. Hey, buddy, welcome back. If you're here, it's probably late where you are. Maybe the house is quiet. Maybe there's a lamp on somewhere behind you. Maybe you're already halfway under the blanket. That's exactly where I want you, so go ahead and get comfortable. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop a little. Nothing you need to do tonight except listen. Tonight we're going somewhere that most history shows skip right over. Not the drawing rooms of Victorian England with their velvet curtains and their string quartets, but the narrow back stairs just behind those rooms. We're going to spend some time with the girls and women who kept those grand houses running quietly, invisibly, from 4 in the morning until long after the family had gone to bed. Before we get going, if you don't mind, go ahead and tap that subscribe button. It costs nothing, it takes 2 seconds, and it means a lot to a small channel like this one. Then just relax, get cozy, and let's slip back in time together. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about Victorian domestic service. It wasn't just hard work. It was, in almost every practical sense, a job designed to be nearly impossible to do well, nearly impossible to keep, and nearly impossible to leave safely once you were in it. Tonight, I want to walk you through exactly why. Slowly, gently, one quiet hour of the day at a time. Let's go inside. The hiring gauntlet, let's start before the job even begins. Because getting a position as a Victorian maid was in itself a strange and precarious little ordeal, and it tells you almost everything about what was waiting on the other side of it. I want you to imagine a young woman, 16 or 17 years old, standing outside a servant's registry office in a mid-sized English town sometime in the 1870s. These registry offices were small businesses, usually run out of a front room, where families looking for servants and servants looking for families would come together, like a marriage broker, except the marriage was between a girl and a household, and it usually lasted about as long as one. She's wearing her one good dress, the plain dark one she keeps for church and for occasions exactly like this. Her hair is pulled back tight. In her hand, she's holding a folded piece of paper, and that piece of paper matters more than anything else about her. It's her character reference, sometimes just called her character. Without it, she is, for all practical purposes, unemployable. It doesn't matter how strong she is, how quick she learns, how honest she's been her whole life. Without a written character from her last employer, or in this case her mother's employer, or the vicar, or someone respectable enough to vouch for her, she simply does not exist as a candidate. And here's where it gets difficult. That reference isn't really about her skills, it's about her behavior. A good character meant she was honest, sober, obedient, and this word shows up again and again in real surviving references from the period, not forward. Not forward with the male members of the household, not forward in her opinions, not forward in asking for time off or higher wages or better food. The entire currency of her working life was built on the idea of being agreeable and unnoticeable at the same time. Now here's the part that made the whole system so unstable. A former employer, even one who had genuinely mistreated a girl, held total power over whether she would ever work again. If a mistress felt slighted, maybe the girl had asked once too often about her half-day off. Maybe she'd been caught reading a letter from a young man. Maybe the household was simply displeased that she was leaving to look for better wages elsewhere. That mistress could write a lukewarm reference or refuse to write one at all, and effectively end that girl's ability to earn a living in service. There was no appeals process. There was no third party to check whether the reference was fair. It was one household's word passed to the next, and the girl in the middle had almost no way to defend herself if it went badly. Let's imagine the interview itself for a moment. She's shown into a small parlor, and the lady of the house, or more often the housekeeper, if it's a large enough household to employ one, looks her over. Not her face first, actually. Her hands, servants' hands, told a story. Rough, red, calloused hands suggested she'd already done real work and knew what she was in for. Soft hands might raise a question about whether she was really willing to scrub floors on her knees for 12 hours a day. Questions come quickly. Where was she from? How many in her family? Was her father living? Was she used to early rising? Could she manage a coal grate? Had she ever been in trouble? A phrase which, in this context, almost always meant one very specific thing, and which we'll come back to later tonight, because it looms over everything in a domestic servant's life far more than most people realize. If she passed this quiet interrogation, she might be offered a position on the spot, often starting the very next day, sometimes within the hour. There was no negotiation over wages in any real sense. The wage was what it was. Take it or don't, and if you don't, the next girl in line at the registry office will. I want you to sit with that for a second. Imagine walking into a room, handing over a piece of paper that represents your entire employment history, and having your future decided in about 15 minutes by someone who has never met you, based partly on the texture of your hands and partly on the goodwill of a woman you've never worked for directly. That was simply Tuesday morning for tens of thousands of young women across Victorian Britain, and it was only the very beginning of what made the job so difficult. Let's go inside the house itself now and see what she was actually walking into. Before dawn, now imagine her first morning. It's the middle of winter, sometime around 1875, in a modest but respectable townhouse. Not a great aristocratic estate, just an ordinary comfortable home belonging to a merchant or a solicitor or a doctor. The kind of household that might employ 2 or 3 servants total. This is actually the more common story than the sprawling country estates we usually picture when we think of Victorian service. Most servants worked in small households like this one, often as the only maid, doing the work that in a grander house would have been split among 6 or 7 people. The alarm, if you can call it that, is simply habit. There is no clock radio, no gentle chime. There is a small tin alarm clock on the floor beside her narrow bed, ticking loudly in the dark, and when it goes off at 5 or sometimes 4:30, she has to silence it fast before it wakes anyone above her. I want you to imagine this for a moment. The room is freezing. There has been no fire up here in the attic all night. Her breath actually shows in the air. The window, if there is one, is small and set into the slope of the roof, and there might be a thin film of ice on the inside of the glass. She swings her legs out from under a wool blanket that never feels quite thick enough, and her feet find bare floorboards that feel like touching stone. She dresses in the dark, mostly by feel, because a candle is an expense, and using one unnecessarily is the kind of small extravagance that gets noticed and remarked upon. Layers first, a chemise stays, though not laced as tightly as a lady's, because she needs to move and bend and lift all day. Then a plain wool dress, dark-colored so the inevitable soot and coal dust won't show as badly. Then an apron, always an apron, sometimes 2, one coarse one for the dirty morning work and a cleaner one to change into once the family is awake. Down the back stairs she goes, narrow, steep, uncarpeted, built specifically so the family never has to walk them and never has to hear her walking them either. The back stairs of a Victorian house tell you everything about how that house was designed to think about its servants, present, essential, and yet somehow meant to be almost invisible, moving through a separate skeleton of hallways and stairwells that ran parallel to the family's world without ever quite touching it. Her first task, before anything else, is the kitchen range. And I want to slow down here, because this is one of those details that most history books skip right past, and it deserves a moment. A coal-fired kitchen range in the 1870s had to be cleared of yesterday's ash, the grate ray laid with fresh coal and kindling, and lit fresh every single morning, and it had to be burning properly with the flue drawing correctly before any cooking could begin. This wasn't flipping a switch. It involved raking out cold ash with a small shovel, careful not to raise too much dust, disposing of that ash, laying sticks and paper, then small coal, then larger pieces, coaxing the fire with a bellows or a folded newspaper fanned by hand, watching the smoke, adjusting the dampers, and doing all of this with hands that were, more often than not, still numb from the cold. And here's a detail that genuinely surprises people when they hear it for the first time. The metal surfaces of the range, the fender, the fire irons, sometimes even the coal scuttle, were polished every single morning with something called black lead, a mixture based on graphite that gave iron and steel a dull, protective shine. This wasn't decorative vanity. Unpolished iron rusted quickly in a damp English climate, and a rusted range looked, to Victorian eyes, like a household in decline. So every morning, kneeling on a cold stone floor, a maid would apply this black paste with a brush, work it in, and then buff it out with cloth or a special brush until it gleamed. Her hands and often her forearms stained gray-black by the time she finished. We'll come back to what that black lead did to her hands and her lungs a little later tonight, because it's part of a bigger story about what this work actually cost the body. But for now, just imagine her kneeling there in the near dark, breath still visible, working a graphite paste into cold iron with her bare fingers, while everyone else in the house is still asleep under warm blankets. By the time the family stirs hours later, this entire process will already be finished, and finished so thoroughly and so quietly that they will never think about it at all. That, in a strange way, was the actual measure of her success, not to be seen doing this work. Just to have it already done. Once the range was lit and drawing well, there were grates to clean in every occupied room of the house, the dining room, the parlor, the study, wherever a fire would be needed that day, each one raked out, black-leaded, and waylaid before the family woke. Then there was hot water to carry up, because in a house like this, running hot water simply did not exist yet in most rooms. That's where we're going to go next, because carrying water was, on its own, one of the most physically brutal parts of the entire job, and almost nobody today has any real sense of what it actually involved. Let's follow her down to the well, or the scullery tap, and see what a single wash meant for the whole household. The water and the weight. I want you to imagine, for a moment, what your morning would look like if every drop of water in your house had to be carried there by hand. In a middle-class Victorian home, water for washing, cooking, and cleaning usually came from a single tap in the scullery, or in older houses, from a pump in the yard, or in the oldest houses still, from a well. There was no hot water tap anywhere upstairs. If someone wanted hot water for washing their face, or for a bath, or for shaving, that water had to be heated over the range in the kitchen, poured into a heavy metal or ceramic jug, and carried up however many flights of stairs stood between the kitchen and the bedroom, by hand. Now, a full jug of hot water is heavy. The standard Victorian washstand jug held somewhere around 2 to 4 pints, which doesn't sound like much until you're carrying it up 3 flights of narrow, twisting back stairs, being careful not to spill scalding water on your own hands or splash it onto a stair carpet that isn't even yours to walk on in the front hallway. And this wasn't a once-a-day trip. This happened morning and evening for every member of the family, and often more than once if someone wanted an extra basin for washing before dinner. Let's think about laundry for a moment, because this is where the sheer physical weight of water really becomes clear. Washing day, which in most households was a specific and dreaded day of the week, usually Monday, meant heating enormous quantities of water in a copper boiler, often built right into the scullery or a separate wash house. A single boiler load could require dozens of gallons of water, and every one of those gallons had been carried there, bucket by bucket, from the pump or the tap. A full bucket of water weighs somewhere around 20 pounds. Filling even a modest copper boiler could mean 20 or 30 trips back and forth with a full bucket in each hand. Then the actual washing began. And clothes and linens were scrubbed by hand against a ridged washboard, or pounded in a large wooden tub with a device called a dolly, which looked something like a short wooden stool on a long handle, used to agitate and pound the fabric in soapy water. Heavy items like sheets and tablecloths, soaked through, could weigh several times their dry weight and had to be lifted, wrung, rinsed, wrung again, and then fed through a mangle, a hand-cranked device with two rollers that squeezed the water out before hanging. I want you to imagine standing over that tub for hours, your forearms burning, your hands raw and cracking from the harsh soap, which was often a strong lye-based soap that stripped the natural oils from skin quickly. Steam rising around you even in a cold room, your back aching from bending over a low tub. And this wasn't the whole job for the day. It was simply Monday's addition to everything else that still had to happen, because the fires still needed tending, the meals still needed cooking, and the family still expected the house to run exactly as smoothly as any other day. The domestic historian looking back at wash day, accounts from the period, has noted that a full laundry day in an ordinary household could involve carrying, heating, and disposing of several hundred gallons of water over the course of a single day, almost entirely by hand, almost entirely by one or two women. Let's slow down and think about what that means in terms of pure physical labor. If a bucket weighs about 20 pounds and a wash day required, let's say, conservatively, 60 or 70 bucket trips between fetching, heating, rinsing, and disposing, that's over 1,000 pounds of water moved by hand, often up and down stairs, often in a single day, on top of every other regular duty of the house. And here's something worth pausing on. This labor was almost entirely invisible to the family living in that same house. They woke to a fire already lit. They found hot water already waiting in the basin. They wore clean linens without ever having seen the tub, the mangle, or the raw, reddened hands that had produced them. The entire purpose of a well-run Victorian household from the family's point of view was that all of this effort should be completely undetectable. If you noticed the work being done, something had gone wrong. That's actually one of the strange, quiet tragedies sitting underneath this whole story. The better a maid did her job, the less anyone thought about her at all. Let's step back upstairs now and look at exactly how thoroughly that invisibility was enforced, because it wasn't just a byproduct of good service. It was a rule, a set of very specific, very deliberate rules, and we're going to go through them slowly. The rules of invisibility. Let's go inside the front hallway of the house for a moment, at around 11 in the morning, when the family is up and about. Imagine our young maid needs to cross from one side of the house to the other, carrying an armful of linens. She hears voices coming from the drawing room, the mistress of the house, and a guest. What does she do? She doesn't walk through. She waits. If there's a back passage, she takes it, even if it's twice the distance. If there isn't and she must cross the main hallway, she moves quickly, eyes down, and if she happens to encounter the mistress or a guest directly, she is expected to turn her face to the wall or step into a doorway, essentially disappearing from view until they pass. This wasn't rudeness on anyone's part. It was simply how the house was meant to function. The servants existed to make life comfortable for the family, and part of that comfort meant never being confronted with the visible machinery that produced it. Etiquette manuals from the period, and there were many of them, extremely popular, sold in the thousands to households trying to run a proper home, spelled this out with remarkable specificity. Servants were instructed not to speak unless spoken to, not to offer opinions on family matters, even when directly asked something adjacent to one, not to laugh audibly, not to sing while working, in some households, though in others a quiet hum was tolerated as long as it didn't carry beyond the room, not to make eye contact for longer than necessary to receive an instruction. I want you to imagine what it would feel like to spend 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day inside someone else's home, constantly monitoring your own face, your own footsteps, your own breathing, so as not to intrude on the atmosphere of a family that isn't yours. Every door had a correct way to be opened, quietly, never letting the latch click loudly. Every tray had a correct way to be carried at a certain height with a certain posture. Even the sound of a maid's shoes on the floor was a subject of instruction in some households. Softer-soled shoes were sometimes required specifically so that a mistress upstairs wouldn't be disturbed by heavy footsteps below. There's a particular phrase that shows up again and again in servants' own later recollections and in domestic advice manuals of the period. The idea that a good servant should be seen and not heard, almost the exact same phrase used for children of the era, and that similarity isn't an accident. Servants, in many respects, occupied a social position that adults of the household were encouraged to think of as perpetually junior, perpetually in need of correction, and perpetually not quite a full person in the room. Let's think for a moment about names, because this detail tends to surprise people the most. In many households, particularly larger ones, a housemaid's actual given name was considered inconvenient if it didn't suit the household's preference, or if a previous maid with a different name had held the position and the family had simply gotten used to calling the role by that name. It was not unheard of for a mistress to simply rename a new maid, calling her Mary, for instance, regardless of what she was actually called at home, because that was the name the position had always gone by in that house. Imagine that for a second. Imagine walking into a new job and being told, essentially, that even your name was subject to the household's convenience. Uniforms reinforced this same erasure. A parlor maid or housemaid typically wore a plain print dress for morning work and switched, in the afternoon, into a black dress with a white apron and cap for whenever she might be seen by the family or visitors. That change of clothing in the middle of the day wasn't about comfort. It was a visual signal, a way of marking the shift from the dirty, physical labor of the morning to the presentable, decorative function she was meant to serve once the household was properly awake and receiving guests. The cap, in particular, served almost the opposite function of what caps usually serve. It didn't distinguish her as an individual. It marked her, visually, as a category. Any maid in any house wearing that cap and apron combination was, to a stranger's eye, functionally interchangeable with any other. And here's a detail that quietly captures the whole atmosphere. In some larger households, particularly ones influenced by more formal continental customs, maids were instructed to face the wall if they happened to encounter a family member in a hallway or on the stairs, waiting there, back to the room, until the family member had passed by completely, not out of any specific unkindness, simply because that was believed to be correct. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. The grown woman pressed against a wall, eyes down, waiting for someone to walk by in her own workplace, because being seen at the wrong moment was itself considered a small failure of her duties. This constant self-erasure took a real, quiet toll, one that doesn't show up in the account books or the etiquette manuals, but that shows up again and again in the diaries and letters that a small number of literate domestic servants left behind. The recurring theme in those personal writings is a kind of aching loneliness, not the loneliness of being alone, because a servant was almost never physically alone, but the loneliness of being constantly present in other people's lives while never quite being allowed to exist fully within them. Let's turn now to what all of this quiet, careful, invisible labor did to the body itself, because the physical cost of this work was every bit as real as the emotional one, and in many ways it left marks that lasted the rest of a woman's life. The body pays. Let's slow all the way down here, because this part of the story tends to get skipped over in most retellings of Victorian domestic life, and it shouldn't be. Think back to that black lead polish we talked about earlier, the one used every single morning on grates and fenders across the country. The main ingredient was powdered graphite, mixed with other substances to create a paste. Applied with bare hands, day after day, year after year, it worked its way into the skin, into the cracks and creases of fingers and palms that were already chapped from cold water and harsh soap. Many former servants recalled, later in life, that their hands never fully lost the gray tint from years of black leading grates. It stained the skin in a way that soap and time couldn't entirely undo. Now think about the knees. This is where a very specific and very real medical term enters the story: housemaid's knee. This wasn't a folk expression or an exaggeration. It refers to a real, documented condition, prepatellar bursitis, an inflammation of the small fluid-filled sac that cushions the kneecap, caused specifically by long periods of kneeling on hard surfaces. And housemaids knelt constantly. They knelt to black lead grates. They knelt to scrub stone floors, sometimes for hours at a stretch, moving backward across a hallway on hands and knees with a scrub brush and a bucket of harsh, cold, soapy water. They knelt to lay fires, to polish brass fittings low on doors and staircases, to clean the undersides of furniture that a lady of the house would never think to check. Doctors of the period documented this condition specifically among domestic servants, and it was common enough that it had its everyday name long before it had wide medical recognition. Some women developed swelling so severe that walking became painful, and yet there was rarely any real option to rest. The servant who couldn't kneel couldn't clean grates, and a servant who couldn't clean grates wasn't doing her job, and a servant who wasn't doing her job could be dismissed, with all the consequences we've already talked about tonight. Let's think about the hands more broadly for a moment, beyond just the black lead staining. Between the lye-based soaps used for laundry, the constant exposure to cold water, and the sheer repetitive strain of wringing wet fabric by hand for hours at a time, chapped and cracked skin was simply a permanent condition for most domestic servants during the colder months. In severe cases, the cracks in the skin, particularly around the knuckles, would split open and bleed, and there was no real remedy beyond a bit of tallow or lard rubbed in at night, if that was even available. Chilblains were another near universal complaint, and if you've never experienced one, imagine an itching, burning, sometimes painful swelling that develops on fingers, toes, and ears after repeated exposure to cold followed by rapid warming. Exactly the pattern a servant would experience every single day, moving between the freezing attic bedroom, the cold stone-floored scullery, and briefly the warmth of a kitchen range she was tending, but rarely allowed to simply stand beside and enjoy. And then there's the sheer accumulated strain of the daily schedule itself. A typical day for a single maid of all work, meaning a household's only servant, responsible for everything, could run from 5 in the morning until 10 or 11 at night, with brief breaks for her own meals, which were often eaten standing in the kitchen or scullery, quickly, so as not to fall behind. Sociological surveys and household account records from the period suggest that many domestic servants worked somewhere between 14 and 16 hours a day, 6.5 days a week, with perhaps one half day and part of a Sunday as her only real time to herself. Over months and years, that schedule produced a particular kind of chronic exhaustion and physical wear that doctors at the time sometimes simply attributed to a servant's constitution, as though some women were naturally suited to hard labor and others weren't, rather than recognizing it as the predictable result of sustained, repetitive, physically brutal work performed on inadequate rest and often inadequate food. Which brings us to something worth pausing on quietly. Meals for servants were typically whatever was left over from the family's table, or a simpler, plainer version of the same food, eaten after the family had been served. In many households, this was perfectly sufficient. In others, particularly stricter or more penny-pinching households, servants' food was noticeably worse, thin, repetitive, and short on the kind of protein and fat that hard physical labor actually demands. Some domestic service reformers of the later Victorian period specifically pointed to poor and monotonous servant diets as a contributing factor in the exhaustion and ill health so commonly reported among young women in service. I want you to imagine, for a moment, going through a 16-hour day of kneeling, scrubbing, lifting, and carrying, on a diet of bread, weak tea, and whatever the family didn't finish the night before. And doing that not for one hard day, but for years, sometimes for an entire working life, from the age of 12 or 13 until a woman either married, aged out of the physical demands of the work, or in the less fortunate cases we'll talk about later tonight, simply broke down under the strain of it entirely. There's a strange, quiet dignity in how invisible all of this remained. The visitor to a well-run Victorian home would never see a chapped hand, a swollen knee, or a servant slumped in exhaustion in a back corridor. They would see instead a beautifully kept house, a warm fire, a well-set table, the finished product of an enormous amount of human suffering that had been carefully, deliberately kept out of sight. Let's go back upstairs to that little attic room now, the one she left before dawn, and take a proper look at what her actual private life looked like. Because even in the few hours she wasn't working, very little of her life belonged entirely to her. The attic room. Let's go inside that little attic bedroom again, this time not at 5 in the morning, but late at night, after the work is finally, truly done. In many ordinary households, the maid's room was tucked directly under the roof, which meant it was baking hot in summer and freezing in winter, because it sat above all the heated rooms of the house and below nothing but slate or tile. The ceiling sloped sharply on at least one side, low enough that she'd learned, without thinking about it anymore, exactly where she could stand up straight and where she had to duck. The window, if the room had one at all, was often a small dormer or skylight, offering a narrow patch of sky and very little else. Furnishing was sparse by any standard. A narrow iron bedstead, sometimes shared with another servant if the household employed more than one maid, and sharing a bed wasn't unusual at all. It was simply an economical use of limited space. A small chest of drawers, or sometimes just a shelf for her few possessions. It was a washstand with a plain jug and basin, the water in it long gone cold by the time she got upstairs to use it, since she'd have carried her own can up earlier if she wanted any warm water for herself at all, which many nights she simply didn't have the energy or the time to bother with. There was, in most households, no lock on this door. Not because privacy wasn't valued at all, but because the room technically belonged to the house, not to her, and a housekeeper or mistress retained the right to enter it at any time, to check on cleanliness, to look for any sign of impropriety, or simply because the house's rules didn't extend privacy to its servants in the same way they extended it to family members. I want you to imagine, for a moment, going through the exact same routine every single night. And climbing those same steep back stairs, now by candlelight, since gas or oil lamps often weren't extended to servants' quarters even in households that used them everywhere else. Undressing quickly in a cold room because there was no fire up here, ever, even in the depths of winter. Heating a servant's bedroom was considered an unnecessary expense in almost every household, regardless of size or wealth. And climbing into a bed that had probably been cold since morning, wrapping herself in whatever blankets she had, and falling asleep almost instantly, not because she wanted to, but because her body simply had nothing left to give the day. Personal possessions were minimal, both by necessity and by expectation. A small trunk brought from home might hold a spare dress, a few undergarments, perhaps a Bible, perhaps a small mirror, perhaps a letter or two from family, kept and reread on the rare quiet evenings when there was time and enough candlelight to do so. There simply wasn't room, financially or physically, for much more. Wages for a general maid in a modest household during the middle of the Victorian period might run somewhere in the range of £10 to £20 a year, on top of room and board, and even accounting for the very different value of money at the time, that left almost nothing after basic necessities, family obligations, and the modest but expected costs of maintaining a respectable appearance for work. And even this small, spare space wasn't entirely her own. Some households maintained explicit rules about what a servant could and couldn't keep in her room. No personal letters from young men, for instance, which we'll come back to shortly. No items considered above her station, and in stricter households, occasional informal inspections to make sure nothing improper was being hidden away. Let's think for a moment about what it means to spend the only truly private hours of your day in a room that isn't fully private at all, in a bed you might share, under a roof that's either baking or freezing depending on the season, with almost nothing around you that belongs entirely to you. And then think about waking up the next morning and doing the entire day over again. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake in most households. It was simply how the whole system had been built, economically, socially, architecturally, around the assumption that a servant's comfort was a secondary consideration at best, something to be provided only after every other need of the household had already been met. Now let's go downstairs one more time, to a place that actually was, in its own strange way, a servant's own small world, the servants' hall, and the surprisingly rigid social order that existed among the staff themselves, entirely separate from anything the family upstairs ever saw. Below STAIRS, here's something that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. In any household large enough to employ several servants, there was an entire social hierarchy among the staff themselves, every bit as rigid, every bit as governed by rank and precedence, as anything happening upstairs among the family and their guests. Let's go inside the servants' hall of a larger household for a moment, say, a comfortable country house employing 8 or 10 indoor staff, which was a common size for a prosperous but not aristocratic family. At the top of this small world sat the butler, if the house employed one, and the housekeeper, who between them ran the entire domestic operation and reported directly to the master and mistress. Below them came the cook, who held enormous authority over her own kitchen domain and was often treated with real deference even by staff technically above her in the household's overall structure, simply because a good cook was so difficult to replace. Then came the lady's maid and the valet, if the family kept them, who occupied a curious middle position, servants themselves, but servants who worked so closely and personally with a single family member that they often absorbed some of that person's social standing by association. A skilled lady's maid, for instance, might have more real influence and comfort within the household than a housemaid who had been there twice as long, simply because of whose room she worked in. Below all of them sat the housemaids, the parlor maids, the kitchen maids, and at the very bottom of the entire structure, the scullery maid, often the youngest girl in the house, sometimes no more than 12 or 13 years old, responsible for the dirtiest, most physically unpleasant tasks of all: scrubbing pots, cleaning the scullery floor, plucking poultry, and generally doing whatever the cook or the other maids didn't want to do themselves. I want you to imagine sitting down at the long servants' hall table for a meal, because even this had a strict order to it. Seating was arranged by rank without exception. The butler and housekeeper sat at the head of the table, the upper servants next, and the youngest, lowest-ranking maids at the far end, sometimes not even permitted to speak unless spoken to by someone of higher rank, in an echo of exactly the same etiquette that governed how they were expected to behave toward the family upstairs. This internal hierarchy could be, in its own way, just as difficult to navigate as anything involving the family. A scullery maid or a young under-housemaid might find herself answering not just to the mistress of the house, but to a housekeeper who held real power over her daily life, her free time, her meals, and crucially, whether she received a good character reference when it came time to move on. Some housekeepers were remembered fondly by the women who worked under them, described in later recollections as strict but fair, even protective. Others were remembered quite differently, as figures who ruled the servants' hall with the same rigid, sometimes petty authority that a difficult mistress might exercise over the whole household. There's something worth noticing here. This internal servant hierarchy meant that the experience of domestic service wasn't uniform at all. The housemaid in a household with a genuinely kind housekeeper, reasonable hours, and decent food might have a difficult but bearable working life. A housemaid in a household with a harsh housekeeper, an unreasonable mistress, and a demanding schedule might find herself in something close to genuine misery, with almost no way to know in advance which situation she was walking into. And there was very little a servant could do to change households easily if she landed in a bad one, because, as we talked about earlier, leaving too quickly, or leaving in a way that displeased her employer, put her character reference at risk, which put her entire future at risk. So a young woman in a genuinely difficult household often had to weigh, very carefully, whether the misery of staying outweighed the risk of leaving without a good reference in hand. Let's sit with that tension for a moment, because it's really the heart of why this work was so difficult in a structural sense, not just a physical one. The system gave a servant almost no leverage. She couldn't easily negotiate her hours, her wages, or her treatment, because the moment she pushed too hard, she risked her reference, and without her reference, she risked her entire livelihood. Now let's talk about something else the servants' hall governed very strictly, something that touched every young woman in service, and that carried consequences far more serious than a bad reference. Let's talk about followers. No followers. Let's imagine, for a moment, a young housemaid named, well, let's just call her Ellen, since Ellen was a common enough name for the period, and could stand in for thousands of real young women whose actual names were never recorded anywhere at all. Ellen is 19. She's been in service for 6 years already, since she was 13. and she's met a young man, a delivery boy, perhaps, or a groom from a neighboring household, or a clerk she noticed at church on her one Sunday a month off. Nothing scandalous. Just the ordinary beginning of the ordinary human experience of being young and interested in someone. Except in most Victorian households, this simple, ordinary thing was explicitly against the rules. The phrase used in the period was "no followers allowed," and it appeared again and again in domestic service advertisements, in housekeepers' instructions, and in the standard terms under which a maid was hired. It meant, quite literally, that a female servant was not permitted to have a young man call on her, walk out with her, or maintain any kind of romantic attachment while she was in service, at least not openly, and often not at all. I want you to think about why a household would care so much about this. Part of it was pure practicality from the family's point of view. A servant with her attention on a sweetheart might be distracted, might sneak out, might let a young man into the house improperly, creating security concerns in an era with real fears about theft and household safety. But a much larger part of it was about something we've already touched on tonight, the fear of what a romantic relationship might lead to and the absolutely devastating consequences that would follow if it did. Because here is the truth sitting at the center of this entire rule, and it's worth saying plainly. If an unmarried domestic servant became pregnant, in the vast majority of households, she would be dismissed immediately, without a reference, regardless of the circumstances. It did not matter whether the relationship had been a mutual, loving one with a young man of her own choosing. It did not matter, and this is the part that should genuinely trouble anyone hearing it for the first time, if the father of the child was actually a member of the household she worked for. A master, a son of the family, a male guest. Let's slow down on this point, because it's important, and because it explains so much of the underlying anxiety running through every rule we've talked about tonight. As a young domestic servant, living inside a private home, largely without the protection of her own family nearby, was in a genuinely vulnerable position relative to the men of that household. Historical records, court cases, and social investigations from the period document, again and again, cases where a maidservant was pressured, coerced, or assaulted by a master or a son of the family, and where the resulting pregnancy led not to any consequence for the man involved, but to the complete and total ruin of the young woman's reputation, livelihood, and future. Because society's rules around illegitimacy placed almost the entire weight of blame and consequence on the woman. A pregnant, unmarried servant would typically be dismissed on the spot, often given no reference, and sent back to her family, if her family was willing to take her back at all, which wasn't always guaranteed, since an illegitimate pregnancy could bring real shame onto a respectable working family as well. If she had nowhere else to go, her options narrowed terribly: the workhouse, an unregulated lodging house, or in the most desperate cases, situations that put her at even greater risk. Meanwhile, the man involved, whether he was a fellow servant, a local young man, or a member of the employing family, generally faced no formal consequence at all. There was no legal requirement in most cases forcing a man to support a child he had fathered outside of marriage, and no social mechanism that damaged his own reputation or employment the way it damaged hers. This is part of why the no followers rule existed with such rigidity, and why housekeepers and mistresses enforced it so strictly, sometimes seeming almost cruel about it from the outside. In a strange, backward way, some of that strictness came from genuine concern. An older housekeeper who had seen this exact tragedy play out before, trying to prevent a young maid under her care from walking into the same trap. But much of it also came from simple self-interest on the part of the household, since a pregnant, unmarried servant was an inconvenience, and in the moral language of the period, an embarrassment that reflected badly on the whole house. So imagine, again, our young housemaid Ellen and her ordinary, harmless interest in a delivery boy she's noticed on her Sunday walks. If she wants to see him again, she has almost no safe, sanctioned way to do it. She can't invite him to call at the house. She can't openly walk out with him in the neighborhood if her employer would disapprove and hear about it, which employers often did, through neighbors, through other servants, through the small, tightly networked world that any English town or village represented at the time. Her only real opportunities come during her limited free time, which, as we're about to talk about, was extremely limited indeed. And if her relationship ever became known, even without any pregnancy involved, simply being caught having a follower could be grounds for dismissal in a strict household. The rule existed not just to prevent the worst outcome, but to prevent the entire category of romantic life from having any foothold at all in a servant's daily existence. I want you to imagine what it would feel like to be young, to feel that ordinary human pull toward connection and companionship, and to know that acting on it, even in the mildest possible way, put your entire livelihood at risk. That's not a small thing to carry through 6 days a week, 14 hours a day, for years on end. Let's talk now about that one small pocket of freedom every domestic servant was granted, the half-day out, because even this, modest as it sounds, came wrapped in its own set of quiet restrictions. The half-day out lets imagine Ellen again, on the one afternoon a week, or in stricter households the one afternoon every other week, that actually belonged to her. The typical arrangement in most Victorian households granted a servant a half-day off, usually on a Sunday afternoon after church duties and the family's midday meal had been served and cleared, plus perhaps one additional evening or half-day sometime during the week. In some households, this was generous and consistently honored. In others, it was treated as a privilege that could be withheld for minor infractions, or quietly reduced whenever the household was particularly busy, entertaining guests, for instance, or during the demanding stretch of preparations before Christmas. Even on her half-day, a servant's freedom of movement was often limited by unspoken but very real expectations. She was expected to be back by a certain hour, often quite early in the evening, sometimes as early as 9 or 10 o'clock, and returning late, even by a small margin, could result in a scolding or, in a strict household, a real black mark against her. She was expected to dress modestly and behave respectably in public, since any hint of impropriety seen by a neighbor or acquaintance of the family could make its way back to her employer through the same tight social grapevine that spread news of followers and courting. I want you to imagine what she might actually do with those few precious hours. And perhaps she walked to visit her own family, if they lived close enough, sitting in her mother's kitchen for an hour, catching up on news, eating a meal that, for once, someone else had cooked for her. Perhaps she went to church again, this time for the simple comfort of it rather than out of obligation, or met a friend from a neighboring household, another servant girl, and the two of them walked together through a public park or along a high street, looking in shop windows at things neither of them could afford, talking about home, about the families they worked for, comparing notes on which households were kind and which were difficult. These friendships between servant girls mattered enormously, more than most accounts of the period give credit for. In a life with so little unstructured time and so few opportunities for real companionship, an hour spent walking and talking with another young woman who understood exactly what your days were like, the same aching knees, the same cold mornings, the same careful, constant self-monitoring, could be one of the only sources of genuine emotional relief in an otherwise relentless week. Some larger towns and cities, as the Victorian period went on, saw an increase in modest public amusements aimed specifically at the working and servant classes, cheap excursion trips by train, public gardens, even early forms of what we'd now recognize as casual social entertainment. As a servant with a full half-day and a little pocket money saved from her modest wages might use it for exactly this kind of small outing, a brief taste of ordinary leisure that most people today would barely register as leisure at all, but that, in the context of her week, felt enormous. And then, always, the return. Back through the servant's entrance, back up the narrow stairs, back into her plain work dress, and back into the rhythm of the household by the following morning, often before the sun was even up, as though the small window of her own life had never happened at all. I want you to sit with the contrast for a moment. 6 days and more of relentless, physically exhausting, constantly monitored labor against a handful of hours, once a week or once every 2 weeks, that belonged to her. And even those hours came with a curfew, a dress code, and the quiet awareness that misbehaving, even mildly, could cost her everything. Let's turn now to something darker, something we've already gestured toward tonight but haven't looked at directly, the real vulnerability a young domestic servant faced from the men within the households she served, and just how little protection existed for her if the worst happened. The danger from above. Let's speak plainly for a few minutes, gently, but honestly, because this part of the story matters, and skipping past it would leave out something essential about why domestic service was so genuinely difficult and precarious for so many young women. It's alive in domestic servant in the vast majority of cases, was a young, often very young, unmarried woman living inside the private home of her employer, with no family nearby, no independent income beyond her modest wages, and almost no formal protection if a member of that household, a master, an adult son, a male guest, behaved toward her in ways that ranged from unwanted attention to outright coercion and assault. Social investigators and reformers of the later Victorian period, looking closely at the conditions of domestic service, documented this vulnerability repeatedly. Because a servant's entire livelihood depended on maintaining her position and her reputation, and because reporting or resisting the advances of a man with power over her employment could result in her own dismissal rather than his, many young women in this situation found themselves with almost no safe path forward. If she complained to the mistress of the house, she risked not being believed, or worse, being blamed for having somehow invited the attention in the first place, since Victorian ideas about female virtue often placed responsibility for sexual impropriety on the woman involved, almost regardless of the actual circumstances. If she simply left the position without a reference to escape the situation, she faced the full weight of everything we've already discussed tonight: unemployment, loss of income, and a permanently damaged prospect of future work. And if a pregnancy resulted, as we talked about a little earlier, the consequences fell almost entirely on her, regardless of who was actually responsible. I want you to imagine for a moment what it would feel like to live inside a house, day and night, sleeping just a few rooms away from someone who held that kind of power over you, with no real ability to simply leave, no easy way to seek help, and a surrounding culture that offered you very little sympathy even if the worst did happen. That's not a comfortable thing to think about, and it isn't meant to be. But it's true, and it's a real part of why service was, for so many young women, a genuinely precarious way to live, in ways that went far beyond sore knees and cold mornings. It's worth saying, too, that not every household was like this, and not every master or son behaved this way. Many families treated their servants with real decency, and many domestic service relationships, particularly long-term ones, developed into something closer to mutual respect and even affection over years of shared household life. Some employers took real, active care to protect young servants under their roof, and some households became, in their own limited way, genuinely safe and steady places for a young woman to build a working life. That balance and complexity is worth holding on to, rather than flattening every household into the same dark picture. But the risk was real, it was structural, and it touched enough households that every young woman entering service understood, at least in the back of her mind, that this was simply part of the landscape she was stepping into. It shaped how she carried herself, how she avoided being alone with certain men in certain rooms, and how carefully she monitored every interaction, on top of everything else she already had to monitor and manage throughout her long working day. Let's turn now to what happened when things went wrong for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. Simple bad luck, illness, or a household that simply decided it no longer wanted her, because dismissal in Victorian domestic service could unravel a woman's entire life almost overnight. Falling without a net. Let's imagine one more time our young housemaid. Let's go back to Ellen, 6 years into her time in service, now 20 years old, experienced, capable, and reasonably secure in her position. One evening she comes down with a fever. Nothing dramatic at first, just aches and exhaustion beyond even her usual tiredness. Within a day or two, it's clear she's genuinely ill, unable to rise before dawn, unable to carry water or kneel over a grate. In a kind household, she might be allowed to rest in her attic room for a few days, with perhaps a doctor called if the family was generous and the illness looked serious. In a less generous one, an extended illness could quickly become a problem, since a maid who couldn't work wasn't earning her keep, and many households operated on genuinely tight margins, where an extra mouth to feed without corresponding labor felt like a real burden. Here's the difficult truth sitting underneath this entire story. There was no sick pay. There was no employment protection. There was no institutional safety net at all, beyond the basic decency of an individual employer, and that decency varied enormously from house to house. If Ellen's illness dragged on for more than a week or two, and if her employer wasn't as generous as we might hope, she could simply be dismissed, sent back to her family, or if her family couldn't take her in, left to fend for herself with no income, no position, and now, on top of everything else, damaged health. And illness was only one of many ways a servant's position could unravel quickly. A change in the family's own fortunes, a business failure, a death, a decision to economize, could mean an entire staff let go with little notice, regardless of how well any individual servant had performed her duties. A change in household needs, children growing up and requiring fewer nursery staff, for instance, or a family relocating to a smaller home, could do the same. None of this reflected on the servant's own conduct or ability, but all of it could end her position just as suddenly as a genuine mistake might have. And then there was simple age. A domestic servant's entire value to an employer rested heavily on her physical capacity for hard, sustained labor. The housemaid in her 30s or 40s, her hands permanently marked by black lead and years of harsh soap, her knees aching with the lingering effects of prepatellar bursitis, her back stiffened by decades of carrying and bending and kneeling, was, in a purely practical sense, less able to sustain the punishing pace of the work than she had been at 18. Some households valued long, loyal service and kept older servants on in less physically demanding roles, easing them gradually into lighter duties as they aged. Many others simply didn't, preferring, when the time came for a new hire, to bring in a younger, stronger girl who could work the long hours at full pace. I want you to imagine, for a moment, being a woman in her late 40s or 50s, having spent her entire adult life in domestic service, with no savings to speak of, since wages had always been modest and largely absorbed by basic necessities and family obligations, suddenly finding herself without a position and without the physical stamina to easily win a new one against younger competition. There was no pension. There was no formal retirement plan. For women without family able or willing to take them in, the honest, frightening reality was the workhouse, the last, dreaded institutional safety net of Victorian England, a place widely feared and stigmatized, associated with the loss of almost all personal dignity and independence. Social surveys and poverty investigations of the later Victorian period, looking at the populations of workhouses across England, found that former domestic servants made up a real and recognizable portion of the elderly women housed there. Women who had spent their entire working lives keeping other people's homes running smoothly, and who had nothing left of their own once their bodies could no longer sustain the pace the work demanded. This is, in many ways, the quiet tragedy sitting at the very center of everything we've talked about tonight. A domestic servant's entire working life was built around service to someone else's household, someone else's comfort, someone else's family. And when that service could no longer be given, at whatever point age, illness, or simple bad fortune brought that day, there was very often nothing waiting to catch her. Let's spend a few final minutes thinking about what all of this adds up to, and about the women, most of them entirely unrecorded by history, their names never written down anywhere, their years of labor leaving behind nothing but a house that ran smoothly and a family that never had to think about how. The rest of the day we've spent a lot of time tonight on the very early morning, the fires, the water, the black lead polish. Let's slow down now and walk through the rest of a single ordinary day, because the hours between breakfast and bedtime held their own particular rhythm, one that most people today would find almost impossible to sustain. Imagine it's now 8:30 in the morning. The family has come down. Breakfast has been laid, and here's a small detail worth noticing. The correct way to lay a breakfast table was itself a small art form, with very specific expectations about where the toast rack sat, how the marmalade and butter were positioned, how the tea things were arranged, and a maid who got this wrong, even in small ways, might receive a quiet but pointed correction from the mistress of the house. Once breakfast has been served and the family has moved into the rest of their morning, letters to write, calls to plan, needlework, reading, the maid's work shifts into what was sometimes called the rough work of the day. Bedrooms need making up, chamber pots need emptying and cleaning, a task nobody particularly enjoyed talking about, but one that had to happen every single morning in a house without indoor plumbing reaching every room. And carpets need sweeping, sometimes with damp tea leaves scattered across them first to help trap dust, a small trick many households used before proper carpet sweepers became common. Furniture needs dusting, mirrors need polishing, and every single room the family might use that day needs to look, by the time they wander back into it, as though no one has touched it at all. By late morning, there might be a brief lull, though rarely much of one, before luncheon needed to be prepared and served, and the whole rhythm of tray carrying, table laying, and quiet, careful serving began again. In households wealthy enough to receive callers in the early afternoon, a parlor maid's job shifted again. Now she needed to be presentable herself, in her afternoon uniform, ready to answer the door promptly, take calling cards on a small silver tray, announce visitors properly, and manage the entire delicate ritual of Victorian social calling, which came with its own extensive set of rules about who could call on whom, at what hour, and for how long. I want you to imagine standing by that front door for a solid stretch of the afternoon, listening for the bell, moving quickly but calmly to answer it, remembering names and titles correctly, and doing all of this while also keeping half an eye on whatever other tasks still needed finishing before dinner. And then dinner. In many respects, dinner was the single most important performance of the entire day, the moment when the household's respectability was most visibly on display, whether for family alone or, more demandingly, for invited guests. The table had to be laid with real precision, correct placement of every piece of cutlery and glassware, a formal order that etiquette books of the period described in extraordinary, almost mathematical detail. Courses had to be brought out in the correct sequence, at the correct temperature, cleared away without a sound, without a dropped fork, without so much as a clink that might draw attention to the process itself. For a house employing a full staff, this meant a genuinely choreographed operation between the kitchen, the cook, and whichever maids were responsible for serving, everyone moving in careful coordination, timed against the rhythm of a meal that might run through 5, 6, or more courses for a proper dinner party. For a smaller household with only 1 or 2 servants, this same standard of presentation had to be achieved by far fewer hands, meaning a single maid might be doing the work that, in a grander house, would have been divided among a whole team. And after dinner, once the family retired to the drawing room for the evening, the real cleanup began, dishes washed in the scullery, often in water that had to be reheated yet again, silver polished and put carefully away, the kitchen restored to order for the next morning's earliest tasks, which, as we already know, began again well before dawn. It's only after all of this, after the fires were banked for the night, after the family's rooms were checked one final time, after any late requests for hot water or extra coal had been answered, could a maid finally climb those narrow back stairs to her own small room and at long last rest. Let's take a moment now to think about how this rhythm changed depending on exactly which role a servant held, because maid wasn't really one single job. It covered a whole range of very different daily experiences, and it's worth understanding a few of those differences before we move on. Not all the same job. Let's take a slower look now at a few of the different roles hiding under that single word, maid, because the day-to-day experience of service varied quite a bit depending on which particular job a young woman held. Start with the scullery maid, right at the bottom of the household hierarchy, and often the youngest member of staff. Her domain was the scullery itself, the cold, damp back room where the roughest, dirtiest work of the kitchen took place. Washing pots and pans blackened by the range, plucking and drawing poultry, a genuinely unpleasant task involving feathers, blood, and the particular smell that comes with it, scrubbing vegetables, cleaning fish, scouring the floor of a room that, by its very nature, was never fully clean for very long. The scullery maid rarely had any contact with the family at all, spending nearly her entire working life in that one cold back room, under the direct authority of the cook, who could be, depending on her temperament, either a genuine mentor to a young girl finding her footing in service, or a harsh, demanding presence who took out her own long hours and pressures on the youngest, least powerful person in the kitchen. Now consider the housemaid, whose world we've mostly been exploring tonight, responsible for the fires, the cleaning, the bedrooms, the endless carrying of water and coal, moving through the house's private and semi-private spaces without ever quite being seen doing it. The parlor maid occupied a slightly different position, one that put her more directly in contact with the family and their guests. She answered the door, served at table in smaller households without a footman, and needed a particular kind of polished, careful manner, since she represented the household's face to visitors in a way a housemaid rarely did. This meant a parlor maid was often chosen partly for her appearance and bearing, in addition to her practical skills, an uncomfortable reminder that a servant's own body and presentation were, in a real sense, part of what she was being paid to provide. The lady's maid held a genuinely different kind of position altogether, working closely and personally with one specific woman of the household, helping her dress, arranging her hair, caring for her clothing and jewelry, sometimes accompanying her when she traveled. This closeness could create real, lasting bonds of loyalty and affection between a lady's maid and her mistress, relationships that in some documented cases lasted decades and carried real mutual warmth. But it also meant a lady's maid's entire working life was shaped by the temperament of one single person, for better or worse, with none of the slight buffer that came from being one face among several household staff. Then there was the nursemaid, responsible for the care of the family's children, often living in extremely close quarters with them, sometimes more emotionally present in a child's daily life than the child's own mother, given how much Victorian upper and middle-class parenting was delegated to hired help. A devoted nursemaid might form a bond with a child that lasted that child's entire life, remembered fondly decades later, even as the woman herself faded from the historical record entirely, her name barely mentioned beyond a warm childhood memory in someone else's later writings. And at the very bottom of the entire domestic pyramid, below even the scullery maid in terms of pure precariousness, sat the maid of all work, the single servant employed by a household too modest to afford more than one, responsible, quite literally, for everything. Every task we've talked about tonight, spread across every role we've just described, fell onto one pair of hands. Historians who have studied Victorian domestic service closely note that the maid-of-all-work arrangement, common in a huge number of ordinary lower middle-class households, was in many respects the hardest and loneliest version of service that existed, precisely because there was no hierarchy of fellow servants to share the burden, no cook to answer to and learn from, no servants' hall companionship at the end of a long day, just one young woman. It's entirely alone with the entire operation of someone else's home. I want you to imagine being that single maid of all work, waking before dawn with no one else in the house to share any part of the coming day's labor, and going to bed again, alone, in a small room, having spoken to almost no one all day beyond brief instructions from the family she served. That particular kind of isolation, layered on top of everything else we've discussed tonight, made the maid-of-all-work position one of the most quietly grueling jobs in the entire Victorian domestic landscape, even though on paper it might have looked like the simplest arrangement of all. Let's turn now to a few of the real voices that have survived from this world, because a small number of domestic servants did leave behind diaries, letters, and later recollections, and their own words carefully, and without quoting them directly, since we want to honor their experiences rather than simply lift their language, help fill in some of the texture we've been imagining together tonight. The real VOICES, most Victorian domestic servants, left no written record at all. They couldn't afford the time, many had only limited literacy, and the entire culture around them treated their inner lives as unremarkable, not worth preserving. But a small handful of servants did keep diaries or write later recollections, and their surviving words give us something the etiquette manuals and household account books never could, a sense of what this life actually felt like from the inside. One of the most detailed surviving accounts comes from a maid-of-all-work named Hannah Cullwick, who worked in service through much of the Middle Victorian period and kept an extraordinarily detailed personal diary across many years, describing her daily labor in granular, unromantic detail. The fires laid, the floors scrubbed, the water carried, the sheer physical grind of a day that started before 5 and often didn't end until close to midnight. What comes through in her writing, again and again, isn't self-pity, but a kind of matter-of-fact endurance, an acceptance of hard labor as simply the shape her life had taken, alongside a real, quiet pride in doing that labor well and thoroughly. Other glimpses come from social investigations of the period. Reformers and journalists interested in the conditions of working women, some connected to early efforts at documenting urban poverty, others focused specifically on domestic service as an occupation, collected accounts directly from servants themselves, describing punishing hours, inadequate food in stricter households, loneliness, and the particular anxiety of a single bad reference standing between a servant and her entire future livelihood. And then there's the strange, indirect testimony offered by the household advice literature of the period itself. Books like Isabella Beeton's famous Guide to Household Management, which, alongside its enormously detailed instructions on cooking and housekeeping, included extensive guidance for mistresses on how to manage, direct, and discipline their servants. Reading these sections carefully, even without a single servant's voice appearing in them directly, tells its own quiet story, a portrait, seen entirely from above, of exactly how much control a Victorian household expected to exercise over the women working within it, down to the smallest details of behavior, speech, and appearance. What strikes me most, thinking about all of this together, is how ordinary it all sounded to the people living through it. Hannah Cullwick wasn't writing an exposé. She was simply recording her days, the way any of us might jot down what happened before falling asleep. The exhausting, body-breaking, tightly controlled life we've spent this whole evening exploring wasn't experienced by the women living it as some dramatic injustice they were constantly railing against. It was simply what life was, the water they swam in, the only shape their days had ever taken. And that in its own way might be the most striking detail of the entire story, not that the work was hard, but that it was hard in a way so completely normalized that almost no one, including the women doing it, thought to write it down as anything unusual at all. Let's turn now to the calendar itself, because a Victorian servant's year had its own rhythm too, built around seasons of extra labor that most modern audiences have never even heard of. The seasons of extra work. Let's imagine, for a moment, the arrival of spring in a Victorian household, because spring meant something very specific and very dreaded to every servant in the house: spring cleaning. This wasn't the light, casual tidying the phrase suggests to modern ears. Spring cleaning, as practiced in Victorian homes, was an enormous, exhausting, top-to-bottom overhaul of the entire house, undertaken once a year, usually timed to the point in the calendar when coal fires were finally being reduced for the season, and the accumulated soot and grime of an entire winter of burning coal could finally be properly addressed. Every curtain came down to be washed or beaten. Every carpet was rolled up, carried outside, and beaten thoroughly with a cane carpet beater to remove months of trapped dust and soot, a task that left arms aching and required real physical strength, since a large carpet, heavy with dust and often damp from the process, could be genuinely difficult to lift and maneuver. Every piece of furniture was moved, every wall wiped down, every window washed inside and out, every piece of brass and silver polished back to a shine that months of coal smoke had dulled. I want you to imagine an entire household's normal work, the daily fires, the daily meals, the daily cleaning, continuing exactly as it always had, while this enormous additional project of deep cleaning was layered on top of it, often stretching across several exhausting weeks. For the maids involved, spring cleaning meant weeks of even longer hours than usual, tackling one room at a time in careful sequence, so that the family's daily comfort was disrupted as little as possible, even as the entire house was, essentially, taken apart and put back together around them. Then think about the opposite end of the year, the run-up to Christmas, which brought its own particular burst of extra labor. The proper Victorian Christmas, especially in a household hosting family gatherings or entertaining guests, meant an enormous increase in cooking, cleaning, and general household activity. Extra dishes to prepare, extra guest rooms to make up and keep warm, extra fires to tend throughout a house now full of visitors, extra laundry generated by all those additional bodies moving through the home. But Christmas did bring one small, genuine bright spot into a servant's otherwise unrelenting calendar: the tradition of the Christmas box. On or around Boxing Day, it was customary for tradespeople, and often for household servants as well, to receive small monetary gifts or tokens of appreciation, sometimes from the family they worked for directly, sometimes from regular visitors and tradespeople who had benefited from a servant's help and courtesy throughout the year. For many servants, this modest seasonal bonus represented one of the only times all year that any extra money came their way beyond their standard wages, and it was often set aside carefully, saved toward some small personal goal, new boots, perhaps, or a gift to send home to family. There was also, in many households, a related and somewhat more contested custom called vails, small tips given to servants by guests staying in the home, in exchange for the extra service those guests required during their stay. This custom had actually been the subject of real social controversy earlier in the broader domestic service tradition, since some households came to rely on the expectation that visiting guests would tip the staff, effectively subsidizing servants' low wages through the generosity, or lack of it, of visitors who had no obligation to give anything at all. By the mid to late Victorian period, many of the more fashionable households had moved away from this system, but its legacy lingered in the general expectation that a servant's modest, fixed wage was never quite the whole story of what she might, or might not, actually take home in a given year. I want you to imagine, then, this yearly rhythm: the brutal weeks of spring cleaning, the exhausting but slightly warmer bustle of Christmas preparations, the ordinary grind of every week in between, and understand that a Victorian servant's calendar offered very few true breaks from labor. Even the holidays that brought the family joy and rest brought her, most often, simply a different, heavier shape of work. Let's turn now to perhaps the most quietly difficult part of this entire story: the very youngest servants, girls who entered this life not as young women of 16 or 17, but as children. The youngest servants, let's speak gently here, because this next part of the story involves children, and it deserves a careful, quiet kind of attention. It was entirely common, particularly among poorer families, for a girl to enter domestic service at 12 or 13 years old, sometimes younger still in the case of the very poorest households, who simply couldn't afford to keep and feed a daughter who could instead be earning her own keep and sending a little money home besides. The girl this young typically started at the very bottom of the household hierarchy, most often as a scullery maid or a general between maid, a term used for a young servant who assisted wherever she was needed, moving between the kitchen and the upstairs work depending on what the day required. Imagine, for a moment, a 12-year-old girl, away from her own family for the first time in her life, living in a stranger's home, waking before dawn, carrying heavy buckets of water and coal that would have strained an adult, working under the direct authority of a cook or housekeeper who had no particular obligation to be gentle with her simply because of her age. Some households, to their credit, took real care with their youngest servants, understanding that a girl this young needed guidance, patience, and a gradual introduction to the physical demands of the work. Others treated a child servant exactly as they treated an adult one, with the same expectations of speed, silence, and endurance, regardless of how young or inexperienced she was. Charitable and reform organizations of the period, along with government inquiries into child labor more broadly, did occasionally turn their attention to the conditions faced by these very young domestic servants, and some of what they documented is genuinely difficult to read even now. Exhaustion, homesickness so severe it affected a child's health, occasional outright cruelty from harsh employers who saw a child servant as simply cheap. Disposable labor rather than a young person still very much in need of care and protection herself. And yet, for many working-class families, sending a young daughter into service wasn't seen as neglectful or cruel. It was seen as practical, even responsible, a way to secure her a roof over her head, regular meals, and a trade that could support her for the rest of her working life, at a time when opportunities for young working-class women were extremely limited in almost every other direction. The domestic service position, however hard, was often genuinely preferable to the alternatives many poor families faced, including factory labor under conditions that could be just as harsh, or simply the strain of one more mouth to feed in an already struggling household. I want you to imagine the particular kind of quiet resilience it must have taken for a child this young to adjust to this life, learning, quickly, out of necessity, to manage her own homesickness, to absorb correction without visible upset, to take on physical tasks her body was barely ready for, and to do all of this while still being, in every other sense, simply a child. Some of these young servants grew into confident, capable senior staff over the following decades, rising eventually to positions like cook or housekeeper themselves, carrying forward the exact same expectations they had once struggled to meet. Others simply endured, year after year, doing the work because it was the work in front of them, with little sense that their circumstances were unusual or unfair, because for so many girls of their background, this was simply what growing up looked like. Let's bring all of this together now, and spend our last few minutes tonight thinking quietly about what this whole picture adds up to. What wages actually bought? Let's take a quieter, more practical turn for a few minutes and think honestly about money, because the economics of domestic service explain a great deal about why leaving this life, even a genuinely difficult version of it, was so much harder than it sounds. The general housemaid in a modest household during the middle decades of the Victorian period might earn somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 20 pounds a year, with cooks and more senior staff earning somewhat more, and very young or inexperienced servants earning less still. On top of this cash wage, she received her food and her lodging, which is part of why the wages themselves look so small to modern eyes. Room and board were factored in as part of the total compensation, not offered on top of a living wage the way we might think of benefits today. Out of that modest cash wage, a servant was often expected to cover her own clothing, at least beyond the basic uniform the household might provide. This meant setting aside money for boots, which wore out quickly given the sheer amount of walking and standing the job required, for underclothes, for the occasional replacement of a worn dress, and for small personal necessities. Many servants also sent a portion of their wages home to their own families, particularly if they came from households where their income made a genuine difference to a struggling family's finances. It wasn't unusual for a young servant to send home a meaningful share of her already modest pay, keeping only a small amount for herself. And then there was the matter of breakages. In many households, if a servant broke a dish, a glass, or damaged some piece of household property through carelessness, the cost could be deducted directly from her wages. Imagine, for a moment, carrying a heavy tray of china up a dim, narrow back staircase, exhausted after a 14-hour day, and understanding that a single stumble, a single dropped plate, wouldn't just mean an accident to apologize for, but an actual, tangible loss from her own already thin pay for that month. This meant that even a servant earning what looked like steady wages often had very little actual savings to fall back on. If she wanted to leave service to marry, she needed some small amount set aside to establish a household of her own. If she wanted to leave a bad position for a better one, she needed enough saved to cover the gap between jobs, since there was no guarantee of finding a new position immediately. And if illness, injury, or old age eventually ended her working life, as we talked about earlier tonight, there was very rarely enough saved to provide any real cushion at all. Some servants did manage to save meaningfully over years of careful, disciplined thrift, and a servant who left service after a decade or more with a genuine nest egg, perhaps enough to help her marry a tradesman or set up a small shop, represented a real, if modest, success story within this system. But for a great many others, the numbers simply never quite worked out that way, and years of hard labor left behind surprisingly little in the way of independent financial security. I want you to hold this thought alongside everything else we've discussed tonight: the physical toll, the constant surveillance, the precarious reference system, the vulnerability to the men of the household, the fear of illness or age ending everything overnight. Layer the simple, quiet math of low wages and thin savings on top of all of it, and you start to see why the entire system held together the way it did. It wasn't just social pressure or moral expectation keeping women in service. It was very often simple economic necessity, with genuinely few other paths open to a working-class woman of the period. Let's talk now about the paths that did exist, because leaving service wasn't impossible, and plenty of women did find their way out into lives that looked quite different from the one they'd known in someone else's attic bedroom. The ways out lets think gently about how a woman's time in service might actually come to an end, in the ordinary, hopeful sense rather than the difficult ones we've spent so much of tonight discussing. Marriage was, by far, the most common exit from domestic service, and in many respects it was the outcome the entire system quietly assumed would eventually happen. A young woman might enter service at 13 or 14, spend a decade or more working her way from scullery maid to housemaid to perhaps a more senior position, and then somewhere in her mid to late 20s, marry a tradesman, a shopkeeper, a skilled laborer, or perhaps even a fellow servant she'd met through the small, interconnected world of household staff moving between neighboring homes. Once married, she would typically leave service entirely, since running her own household, and often soon caring for children of her own, became her full-time occupation instead. This is actually part of why so many households preferred hiring young, unmarried women in the first place, and why marriage among servants was so carefully monitored and restricted, as we discussed earlier with the no-followers policy. The household wanted the years of a servant's most capable labor, and understood, implicitly, that those years were likely to end once she married and moved into a household of her own. For those who didn't marry or who married later, there was also the possibility of rising within the ranks of service itself, into more senior positions like cook, housekeeper, or lady's maid, roles that came with better pay, somewhat more autonomy, and in many households, a genuine measure of respect and authority within the domestic hierarchy. The skilled cook, in particular, held real value to a household and could often negotiate better terms than other staff, precisely because good cooks were difficult to replace and word of a talented cook's skill spread quickly among households looking to hire. Some women, particularly those who had spent years as a lady's maid or a governess-adjacent role in a genuinely affectionate household, found a kind of long-term security in staying with one family for decades, becoming almost a fixture of that household, trusted and valued in ways that went beyond a simple employer-employee relationship. These long-term, loyal arrangements represented some of the better possible outcomes within the system, offering a stability and even warmth that the more precarious, short-term positions rarely provided. And a smaller number of women left service altogether for other kinds of work as the Victorian period progressed and new opportunities slowly opened up, positions in shops, in the expanding world of factory and mill work, and later in the period, in some of the new clerical and retail roles that industrial and commercial growth was beginning to create for women. These alternatives came with their own difficulties, often long hours and low pay in their own right, but they did offer something domestic service structurally couldn't: a clearer separation between work and personal life, a defined workday with an actual end to it, and a home of one's own to return to at night, rather than an attic room inside someone else's house. I want you to imagine, for a moment, the particular relief of that separation, of walking out of a factory or a shop at the end of a long shift and going somewhere that was entirely, unambiguously yours, rather than remaining day and night inside the very same walls where you also worked. For all the real hardships of early industrial labor, that boundary between work and home was something domestic servants, almost by definition, never fully had. Let's bring things to a gentle close now and think about what this whole story, taken together, really tells us. The country house and the town house. Before we settle into our closing thoughts tonight, I want to take you to one more place, because everything we've discussed so far has mostly imagined an ordinary middle-class townhouse. Life looked a little different, in some important ways, inside the great country houses of the period, and it's worth spending a few quiet minutes there too. Imagine, for a moment, a large country estate, employing not 2 or 3 servants, but 20, 30, sometimes many more, spread across an enormous house with wings and floors that a family member might rarely visit at all. In a house this size, the servant hierarchy we talked about earlier became even more elaborate and more strictly enforced, with a butler and housekeeper presiding over a genuinely large staff, each servant occupying a narrowly defined role within an intricate, almost military structure of rank and responsibility. One detail that tends to fascinate people once they hear about it is the bell system. Because a country house was so large, and because family members might be anywhere within it at any given moment, most great houses installed an elaborate network of bell pulls in every room, each connected by wires running through the walls to a bell board in the servants' area below, usually near the kitchen. Each bell on that board was labeled for a specific room, and when it rang, whichever servant was nearest would see which room needed attention and go immediately to answer the summons. I want you to imagine standing in the servants' hall of a great house, glancing up every so often at that long row of bells, alert to any small vibration or ring among them, understanding that a single small movement on that board might mean dropping whatever task was in hand and hurrying up several flights of stairs to answer whatever the family required, whether that was more coal for a fire, a fetched book, or simply a question about the day's plans. This system meant a servant in a great house was never entirely off duty, even during the quieter stretches of the day, because that bell board represented an ever-present possibility of sudden demand. Life in a large country house also meant a strange kind of physical remoteness from the family a servant worked for. In the smallest households, a maid-of-all-work interacted with her employers constantly, throughout the day, in close and sometimes uncomfortably intimate proximity. In a great house, by contrast, many junior servants might go entire weeks without any direct interaction with the family at all, working instead within the vast, self-contained world below stairs, following instructions passed down through the housekeeper or butler, rather than receiving them directly. This created its own particular texture of experience, less of the constant personal scrutiny we discussed earlier in a small household, but also less of any personal relationship or warmth that might otherwise develop between a family and the servant caring for their daily needs. Rural households, meanwhile, often relied on servants drawn from the immediate local community, meaning a young woman in service in the countryside might actually live within walking distance of her own family, allowing for more frequent, if still limited, visits home. Urban service, by contrast, especially in a growing city like London, often meant servants who had traveled considerable distances from their home villages to find work, arriving in a large, unfamiliar city with genuinely limited connections beyond the household itself, a form of isolation that added its own particular loneliness to the already demanding nature of the work. Let's carry all of this with us now, everything we've explored tonight, and spend our final stretch imagining one woman's whole life in service, beginning to end, gathering up everything we've talked about into a single, quiet story. One life from beginning to end. Let's imagine, one final time, a complete life, gathering everything we've talked about tonight into a single quiet story. We'll call her Ellen again, though of course she stands in for thousands of young women whose real names were never recorded anywhere at all. Ellen is born in 1855 in a small village in the English countryside, the fourth of 6 children in a laborer's family that has never had quite enough money to comfortably feed everyone at once. By the time she's 12, it's already understood, without much discussion, that she'll go into service. Her mother had done the same at roughly the same age, and her mother's mother before her. It isn't spoken of as a hardship, exactly. It's simply the shape a girl's life takes in a family like hers. She starts as a scullery maid in a modest house 2 villages over, arranged through a family connection rather than a formal registry office, since at 12 she's really too young for the more competitive, formal hiring process we talked about at the very beginning of tonight's story. Her first months are hard in a specific, disorienting way: homesick, unused to the constant work, learning quickly that crying is not something she's permitted to do where anyone might see her. By 16, she's moved to a larger household in a nearby market town, now working as an under-housemaid, and this is where our story tonight really began: the early mornings, the black lead polish staining her hands, the careful, invisible choreography of a well-run household. She develops housemaid's knee in her early 20s, the ache never quite leaving her for the rest of her working life, though she learns to manage around it, padding her knees with an extra fold of cloth when she kneels at the grates. At 19, she meets a young man, a clerk at the local corn merchant's, on one of her rare Sunday afternoons off. Their courtship, such as it is, unfolds slowly and carefully, almost entirely within the narrow window of her half-days, since her employer maintains a strict no-followers policy and Ellen has seen firsthand what happens to girls who are caught disregarding it. They marry when she's 23 and she leaves service for good, the way so many women of her background eventually did, to run a household of her own, modest as it is, and to raise the 3 children who follow over the next several years. But let's imagine, for a moment, a slightly different version of this same life, because not every story followed this same gentler path. Imagine Ellen instead never marrying, staying in service into her 30s and 40s, gradually rising to the position of housekeeper in a comfortable household after nearly 20 years of steady, reliable work. By this point, she carries real authority within that household, training younger maids the way she herself was once trained, passing along both the practical skills and the quiet, careful discipline of invisibility that the work demands. Or imagine a harder version still. Imagine Ellen dismissed without a reference in her early 20s after a misunderstanding with a difficult mistress, struggling for months to find new work, taking in laundry from her own small rented room to make ends meet, eventually finding a lesser position in a stricter household that pays less and demands more. Imagine illness catching up with her in her 40s, her body worn down by decades of kneeling, lifting, and carrying, and no substantial savings to fall back on. Imagine, in the hardest version of this story, her final years spent in a workhouse, her decades of quiet, invisible labor ending not in comfort or gratitude, but in an institution she had spent her whole working life dreading. All three of these versions of Ellen's life are true, in the sense that all three happened, countless times over, to countless real women across the length and breadth of Victorian Britain. Some married well and left the hardship behind. Some rose within the system and found a measure of stability and respect. And some fell through every safety net the era offered, which is to say, almost no safety net at all, and ended their lives with little to show for decades of genuinely hard and valuable work. What ties all these versions together, though, is the sheer volume and difficulty of what came before whichever ending Ellen's own life happened to find. The fires lit before dawn. The water carried, bucket by bucket, up steep back stairs. The knees worn raw against cold stone floors. The careful, constant management of her own face and footsteps and voice, so as never to intrude on a family that wasn't hers. The quiet, ever-present fear of a single mistake, a single illness, a single unwanted advance from the wrong man, unraveling everything she'd built. I want you to sit with her for a moment, in whichever version of her story feels most real to you tonight, and simply notice how much of an ordinary Victorian household's comfort, its warm rooms, its polished silver, its perfectly laid tables, its clean linens and well-tended fires, rested entirely on the invisible, unrecorded labor of women like her. Let's take a few final minutes now to think about how different all of this is from the world you're falling asleep in tonight. How different this all is. Let's slow all the way down now, because I want to leave you with a few gentle comparisons before we close out tonight, the kind of quiet observations that might follow you into sleep. Think about your own morning tomorrow. Somewhere in your home, a thermostat is probably already set to bring the temperature up gradually before you even open your eyes, so that by the time you're ready to get out of bed, the room is warm, without a single match struck, without a single lump of coal carried anywhere. Hot water is waiting for you at the turn of a tap, arriving instantly, with no one having heated it over a fire and carried it up a flight of stairs on your behalf. If you want light in the middle of the night, it's a switch, not a match, and a candle stub kept carefully rationed. Think about how much of what filled Ellen's entire day has simply been automated out of existence for most of us. Washing machines have replaced the dolly tub and the mangle. Vacuum cleaners have replaced the carpet beater and the tea leaves scattered to trap dust. Central heating has replaced the daily ritual of laying and lighting a dozen separate fires throughout a cold house. A single dishwasher does, in about an hour, what once took a servant most of an evening, standing at a scullery sink with hands raw from harsh soap. And think, too, about the parts of Ellen's life that had nothing to do with machinery at all, but with something more fundamental. The simple expectation running through her entire existence that her comfort, her privacy, her romantic life, and even her own name were secondary considerations, subject to the convenience of the household she served. Most of us falling asleep tonight take for granted things Ellen never had any real claim to at all: a door that locks, a schedule that's genuinely our own, a body of our own that isn't constantly on call to somebody else's bell. I don't say any of this to make you feel guilty about your warm house or your hot shower or your own private room. Quite the opposite, really. I say it so that tonight, as you drift off, you might notice those small comforts a little more clearly than usual, and feel a small, quiet gratitude for them, the same way you might feel a small, quiet gratitude toward someone who did something kind for you a long time ago and never asked for anything in return. Because in a strange way, that's exactly the relationship we all still have with women like Ellen, even now, even generations later. It's almost nothing in the historical record remembers her by name. No plaque, no portrait, no diary entry beyond the rare few that happened to survive by chance. And yet the entire comfortable, orderly world she helped build and maintain, one fire and one carried bucket of water at a time, quietly shaped the expectations of comfort and domestic order that still echo, in smaller and gentler ways, through how many of us think about home even today. Let's bring things to a close now, gently, the way we started. So that's the quiet, ordinary, almost impossible life of a Victorian domestic maid. Not one dramatic tragedy, but a long, slow accumulation of small structural difficulties, stacked one on top of another, until the whole thing became something close to a trap for so many of the young women who lived inside it. The hiring process that hinged entirely on a single reference. The impossibly long days built around invisible, back-breaking labor. The rules meant to erase her presence from the very rooms she kept clean and warm. The physical toll that marked her hands and her knees for the rest of her life. The narrow, precarious path around romance, courtship, and the very real danger some of these young women faced from the men of the households they served. And waiting at the far end of it all, the quiet fear of what happened when age or illness finally caught up, with no safety net standing ready to catch her. And yet, within all of that difficulty, there was also skill and pride and quiet companionship among the women who shared this life together, and in many cases, genuine warmth between servants and the families they served. It wasn't only hardship. It was also an entire world, complex and fully human, that simply happened to be built on a foundation most people upstairs never had to think about at all. If tonight's story helped you drift off, or if you just enjoyed spending this quiet hour somewhere so different from your own evening, I'd love it if you left a comment letting me know whenever you happen to wake up and see it. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next quiet corner of history we visit together. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.